Satnam, this is Satpura Kaur coming to you with our Dharma talk on the nature of the mind. So, as human beings living out in the world, we're constantly seeing a reflection of our own thoughts. And the mind, in its nature, is self-referential. And like a house of mirrors, it can reflect back upon itself over and over and over again, tricking us into believing our own thoughts. So this is one of the qualities of mind that helps us to lift above it through consciousness, as the Alma quote directed us, that consciousness rises like a flame. And the mind in and of itself often circles the drain and takes us into some self-negating habits. When Buddhist Dharma talks about the mind, they always touch their heart, the mind, because they recognize that the mind is intrinsically intertwined with feelings, emotions, the sensory self. So the mind is much more subtle than the material body, perhaps, but it is intrinsically related to what we're eating, the quality of the air, our environments. So many of our thoughts are based on our surroundings. Another principal key to understanding your own mind and its nature is recognizing that the mind is not local. The mind is constantly moving and connected out into the vast universe. And so your thoughts aren't necessarily your thoughts, but could be from any myriad places around. People you're connected to, your thoughts and feelings about them or memories can come in at any time. So the mind isn't local. The mind is constantly moving. Another quality of the mind that helps us kind of understand why we think the things we think is that it works in contrast. It works in polarities. So in the same way that the universe was created, the oneness became two, the two became three, the three became the multiplicity, to put it very, very succinctly. The mind operates from that fundamental split of the oneness, and it wants to constantly look at things from a perspective of contrast, polarity, good, bad, male, female, light, dark. And so the mind operates in this fundamental way. One final way that we want to talk, the way Yogi Bhajan talks about the mind, is in these facets. And when we look at that quote from Amma that inspired the talk, the mind like water moves. The mind automatically, it works automatically. It automatically moves. You don't have to consciously think thoughts. It's automatic. And Yogi Bhajan described this automatic nature of the mind in his description of the 10 bodies. So there are, of these 10 light bodies in the human consciousness and self-sensory human, there are 3 minds. And the first mind is the negative mind. It's the most automatic mind, defense. It's the mind that automatically thinks, how will this harm me? The second automatic mind is the positive mind. And he called these functional minds, but they're automatic processes. So the negative mind is the fastest automatic response of the mind. The positive mind looks for the opportunities. So as the negative mind rises up and says, how will this harm me? The positive mind says, what's the opportunity here? How can I expand into this? And the third functional mind, as described by Yogi Bhajan, is the neutral mind. And this is where we have to consciously be conscious of our consciousness. We have to actually rise above this automatic process of the mind to protect ourselves or to look for the the get, right? What's the opportunity? And say, what's best for everyone? Because what's best for everyone is what's best for me. This is consciousness. And consciousness must rise. It must triangulate. It must find the diagonal. And that's how the neutral mind works, is it looks for that diagonal. It looks for the third. It looks for God. We've been working on a Shabbat in the evenings by Kabirji, and it talks about when the diamond of the Lord penetrates, penetrates like putting a thread through the eye of a needle, penetrates the diamond of my own mind. The fickle nature, the wave-like nature of my own mind merges and becomes one with the consciousness of the one. And this is what we're going toward as yogis through our meditation practice, through our japa, through our mindfulness and awareness practices of consciousness. We're wanting the diamond mind of God, of the Lord, to penetrate the diamond-like nature of our own mind. I started with that self-referential nature of the mind. It just goes on and on and on, reflecting back upon itself. And so we need this penetration of consciousness, of the higher mind, to reach into our own mind and allow our ego to relax and merge with that oneness of the diamond mind of the Lord. Because Yogi Bhajan talked about the mind, our own mind, as a diamond, this multifaceted, multi-reflecting light. But what happens if we allow the negative mind, the automatic, functional nature of the mind, to be the predominating force of our thoughts? We lose that diamond-like light that our mind can be. And so we have to bring in consciousness. We have to bring in awareness. We have to understand how the mind works so that we're not fighting against its nature, but in fact, using that same nature to understand the quality of consciousness, shunya, stillness. Because that wave-like nature of the mind, it's like a hurricane. We can't fight against it with effort. We have to simply become still within the eye of the hurricane. We have to still our consciousness, our higher mind, so that those waves no longer affect us. Guru Nanak says, thinking, thinking, thinking. We can think a million thoughts and the thoughts will never stop thinking. Manjit hai jagjit. Conquer the mind and we conquer the world. So in reflecting on how we see the world outside of us, it is in its very nature our own mind reflected back to us. And the ego doesn't want us to see that. And so we need this outside teacher for a while. We need the teacher to show us what's true and what's not. And then that diamond-like nature of the mind, as it merges with truth, as it merges with the one, as it drops away buying into the contrast nature of the mind, always looking for the polarity. When we understand that consciousness can rise beyond that, we can then start looking into our own self as teacher. But that quality of the mind, understanding the nature of the mind, understanding that it's not local, that it looks for contrast, that it wants to perceive the future, it wants to know what's happening, right? So it makes up stories about what's going to happen. When we know these things about the mind, we can then understand how consciousness can serve us to elevate beyond that functional nature and instead help us move into consciousness, becoming consciously conscious of our consciousness and self-sensory beings. And so the subtle nature of the mind is reliant upon the food we eat, the air we breathe, the surroundings we bring ourselves. The mind that wants to anticipate this impersonal nature of the mind, manas, that remembers things and builds the future upon that memory. That is the nature of our mind that wants to know. We want to know, right? We don't want to have to believe or perceive. We want to know. And that knowing can only come from consciousness and intuition. The nature of the mind as local, not local, it's everywhere, helps us understand that our thoughts are not our thoughts. And it is our consciousness that can select the thoughts that serve us, serve those around us. Right? So part of understanding the nature of the mind is to not let ourselves off the hook, but instead understand how can consciousness rise us above the fundamental ground of the mind into a way of living that is conscious, into a way of living that conquers that very nature of the mind so that it becomes our servant and not us serving our own mind. This is the key. So, when you understand that the mind looks for those polarities, you understand that you're not inherently judgmental. Instead, that's just how your mind works. When you understand that your mind isn't local, that it's moving and it's fluctuating and it's pulling in information from all over, you can understand that I wake up feeling ugh sometimes. It may not be my feeling. And this is why we do sadhana. This is why we chant. This is why we do japa. So that we can clear and understand what's mine and what's not mine. When we understand the nature of the negative mind to move automatically to defend ourselves, we can reflect, we can take a breath. We can allow the consciousness to follow the breath rather than the action to follow the automatic nature of the mind. And we can say, I'm safe. And we can affirm ourselves to be willing to consciously sacrifice, be willing to move out of that negative mind into the neutrality of what's best for everyone is what's best for me. And that's the strength to sacrifice, that we arise and conquer the mind and find the fuel to serve. So understanding the nature of the mind can help us rise above it, like consciousness, like a flame. And I think today is the anniversary birthday of one of the greatest consciousness rising souls in the planet, Maya Angelou. And she is the living embodiment of rise. Rise above. And use your consciousness to elevate everyone around you. So in her memory, I bring this to you, this little understanding of our mind from the teachings of Yogi Bhajan, so that you can use your consciousness to serve yourself and serve others to also rise. Satnam.